Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the AIM Growth Partners podcast. Today, I'm joined by James Chapman, the co-founder of Decently.
Hi, David. Yeah, fantastic to be here, and thanks for inviting me to join the podcast.
I understand have recently celebrated your fourth birthday over the weekend. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, it's in some ways it's gone in the blink of an eye since me and my co-founder were sitting around my kitchen table coming up with business names and quickly checking them on Companies House to see whether they existed just over 4 years ago. And yeah, here we are kind of celebrating our fourth birthday. And, like any startup, it's not all been sort of A to B. There's been some bumps and turns along the way, but it's fantastic to get to this stage. So yeah, we celebrated as a team, and we look forward to what the next few years have in store for us.
Brilliant. And before we get stuck into the business itself and your mission and how you are kind of being disruptive and revolutionary in this space, let's begin with a bit of an introduction, first of all, to you. And, who was James prior to setting up the business?
Yeah, thank you. It's always a strange one, kind of talking about yourself and thinking what might be interesting to or semi-interesting to other people. But yeah, I guess I'd describe myself as a technologist first and foremost. I've always worked in and around technology, and when I look back, kind of on the different roles that I've had, I guess there's some key themes. I started my career after university working for the Met Office as a trainee weatherman. So if I'd gone down that route, I might have been telling you that it's going to rain today. But yeah, in that role, I was working with data, and looking for trends and insights. And then I spent a long time working in huge corporate organizations, so in banking. But again, looking back, the trends were around how can we use technology to provide the ability for people to do a better job, whether that's through data, whether that's through doing things smarter. And I guess I've taken that now for the last 10 years into the health tech. So prior to Decently, which, as I said, we set up 4 years ago, I've worked in and around startups. I've worked in the NHS. I've done some consulting myself, but it's all been about how can we solve a clinical problem through improving technology. So really starting with, what's the impact that we want to make? What's the clinical need that we're trying to address, and then bringing in the right solution. So I guess, yeah, people problem first, technology second. And that's the space that I love to play in, because I'm not a technologist. I'm not a coder. I'm not a developer. I'm not a technical founder, but I've always found a passion in bringing technology, people, and problems together.
So data was a central theme throughout kind of all of the jobs and all the work you've done since graduating. What was it that kind of drew you to the medical space? Was it kind of coincidence, or was that sort of by design?
No, so going back, yeah, probably about 10 years ago now, I was running my own very first startup, which was more of a classic kind of digital design agency at the time. So doing projects across different sectors in retail, in sports. And I realized that actually, as much as I enjoyed that, I wanted to build something, or build a product that, had a greater impact. And I think that was really what initially led me to looking at health tech opportunities. I'd probably say I stumbled into my first opportunity, though, when we moved to Liverpool. I used to live in Edinburgh for a long time, and moved to Liverpool, and I joined a digital health startup that was working on all kinds of fascinating problems, like how to help children who've got anxiety and depression, or how to use big data to change traffic lights to get ambulances from, A to B quicker to reduce response times. And I think it was that kind of immersion into health tech that really gave me the passion to keep on down that route. So yeah, from that point onwards, just been, I guess, obsessed with, how we can build clinical products to improve people's lives. Because as much as it's great getting a paycheck for building someone's website that's going to help them sell, I don't know, coaching services, or help someone make more money through an e-commerce website, I guess at the end of the day, it left me feeling a little bit hollow, and almost, what's the purpose of what I'm doing? So I think a combination of that really drew me to do something that's more purpose led. And that led me into that.
I love that. So it sounds like it was so important for you creating that alignment between your sort of interest in data and your passion for actually delivering outcome based, solutions, but in a more impactful sort of industry.
Absolutely. And I think I've always been naturally drawn to problems that maybe other people haven't solved before either. It's not saying, that some of the things we've worked on have been absolutely cutting edge, but some of the problems that we've worked on are maybe have been underrepresented in terms of the amount of innovation or the amount of investment that they've had in them. So I guess I've been drawn to that. For example, what we're doing now in neuro behavior, there's not a lot of the bigger players who are interested in some of that stuff because it's maybe a bit niche or it's maybe a bit too small in terms of total market size. So I guess, yeah, I've always been drawn to searching out maybe some of those problems that other people aren't interested in.
What was it in the 6 years of health tech experience you had prior to setting up Decently? What was it that drove you to this mission? Was it that? Was it that it was such an underserved portion of the population or the clinical population? Or what was it that you noticed in those first 6 years that was the planted the seed and really kind of ignited the fire in your belly to grow decently?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think probably a combination of different factors. I think working across so many different projects in the early days when I was in this health tech agency, at any one time we might have like 20 different projects on the go, but they were all engaging with different parts of the healthcare system. I think the commonality was that, clinicians do an amazing job day in, day out, whether that's in the NHS, whether it's in private healthcare. And it wasn't a lack of clinical expertise that was kind of holding people back. It was that they didn't have the right tools. They didn't have the right information at the right time to make the best decisions. And I think that was a common thread probably across, the vast majority of all the projects that I worked on. So I think that was always burning sort of desire to go, look, why can't we equip hardworking frontline clinicians with better technology. They're still operating with clipboards and pen and paper and hacking together an Excel spreadsheet when actually, we've got mobile apps, we've got web apps, we've got AI, we've got blockchain, we've got, all these technologies emerging at the same time, but people weren't being able to access them. So I think that probably, drove me to want to do something about it. But the data element of it, I guess, is that there is a lot of data, in healthcare. When you go through a hospital, you've got observational data that's, maybe taken about blood pressure or medication data, but behavioral data, which is what we've been specializing in for the last 4 years, again, is quite underserved. There's not a lot of tools out there, but behavioral health is a massive part of anyone's recovery. Whether you're recovering from a brain injury, whether you've got dementia, whether you're suffering from PTSD, if you speak to patients and families, you'll find out that it's the behavioral challenges that are impacting people's recovery just as much as it is that their broken arm needs to heal. So I think, yeah, that combination of equipping people with the right tools, but really focusing on this underserved area of health, which is all around behavioral data.
And why do you think that area is so underserved?
I think it's harder to measure the impact, and it's harder to monetize in some ways, and that's maybe why bigger, organizations have just done their, sort of SWOT analysis on a market and gone, there's not enough money in this. So, I guess it depends on what your motivation is in the first place. If you look at brain injury, for example, where we've been working, there's only, around 500,000 people a year who will suffer from a brain injury and then go on to have behavioral issues as a result of that brain injury. So as a total proportion of the population, it's much, much smaller than say, cancer or diabetes or COPD. So I think some of it is to do with the size of the patient population. And some of it is to do with the fact that, it's not as easy to sort of measure the impact of tracking someone's behavior over time as it is to see, right, we've given them a new medicine. Does that help them in the next 2 days? Because some of it's a longer burn, and that's why you need the trends, the analysis, and the tools to keep on collecting that information.
I don't know if you noticed it or engaged in it. One of our mutual connections posted recently about an investor meeting they had had. Um, Doing using kind of behavioral analysis as well, and the investor was sort of saying, "Why don't we use facial recognition detection and something like that?" And it's like you're trying to improve mental health outcomes in whatever population. Do we really want something that's invasive like that? But to your point, it's how do we commercialize this? How do we monetize it? And it's interesting hearing about that kind of disconnect, what investors want and what they think they can sell versus what's actually going to drive those meaningful behavior changes.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, and we're jumping into the sort of the business side of things now. That we are growing a business, and customers and revenue is a lifeblood of any business. Unless you're a charitable organization, or you've stumbled across a war chest of money and you can just sort of do it out of your own sort of pocket. We have to balance that. We are a purpose-led organization who really want to make a difference to people's lives at an individual level, but we still need to make money. We still need to find a way to balance purpose and profit at the end of the day. Although being a startup, we're probably still a few years away from profit, but you get what I mean.
And following that theme, because I think it's such an interesting one, particularly in the healthcare space, of how you've gone about balancing those things, the profit or making money with purpose as well. So specifically talk to me, like what was the plan and what was the mission when you started the business, and how's that sort of evolved and changed over the last 4 years?
Sure. Yeah, we actually had quite a clear vision when we set out. So me and my co-founder had worked together before in a previous organization, which was a joint venture. And we knew each other, we trusted each other, we knew each other's strengths. And I could probably talk to you all day about the benefits of having a really good co-founder. But we spent quite a lot of time before we even set up the business thinking about what we want to achieve, how we want to run the business, how we want to engage with customers, with patients, how we want to treat our staff. So we had foundations for the business before we even set the business up. And I think that really helped us in those first couple of years kind of set that kind of those goals for what we wanted to achieve. So to begin with, we knew foundationally we didn't want to be an agency. We didn't want to be working project to project and never having enough resources to really make a difference. We were very clear from the outset we were building a product. We were going to be a product-led business. Second was that to begin with, we didn't nail our colors to the mast in terms of health tech. We actually explored a number of different areas that could allow us to have that purpose-led impact. So we looked at education, technology opportunities, which is where his background was. We looked at things like net zero and sustainability, but we kept coming back to health tech, and we kept seeing the opportunities. Around the same time, unfortunately, a good friend of mine suffered from a fall after a night out, and he suffered from a brain injury. He was in a coma for a number of weeks, and then he made a really good recovery now, but it's been a long road for him. So I think a combination of all of that, seeing the opportunities up close, talking to people who'd actually been impacted by some of these problems, and seeing the opportunity within sort of the clinical sort of environment, I think it was almost a perfect storm for what we ended up doing. So yeah, I think having that sort of time up front before we just jumped into something to really explore how we wanted to operate, what we wanted to work on, it allowed us then to very early on in the business just put everything behind that, and 4 years of day in, day out, just working on one single product. There's still so much we want to achieve, but if we hadn't done that, if we hadn't spent the sort of the early days becoming aligned behind the problem and the why and the how, we probably wouldn't be where we are now. So I don't know whether that quite answers your question, but yeah, a lot about kind of upfront, you know, where do we want to be? Where do we want to be in a year's time, 2 years time, 5 years time, before we actually started the race, as it were?
No, I love that, and it absolutely does answer the question. I'm always guilty of kind of veering people off down a philosophical route or starts talking about religion and whatever, but it all kind of centers around the same thing, and that's, finding your why. I think regardless of what startup you're in, and you mentioned some of the other sectors and industries you were considering, it's so important to have a why. And I really appreciate you sharing that story of like what your why is, because I think anchoring onto that can quite often be the difference between, weathering the storm when the going gets tough, which inevitably it does for any startup,
Yeah.
and actually kind of folding it some of the earlier hurdles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, without kind of going sort of too close to home in my friend's story, then, a lot of what we saw, he was going through, the more people that we spoke to, we realized, this wasn't a unique problem. There was countless stories that we've heard over the years, of how, suffering from a brain injury or, early onset dementia or PTSD has led to these sort of behavioral challenges within someone's recovery. So we realized quite quickly that this was actually quite a big problem. This wasn't, sort of localized to one area of the country or even the UK. But very much, that personal story of knowing what happened to my friend, it did give us that why. And I think we tried to bake that in quite early to probably never actually told this story to a kind of another member of the team that we is called Joe. So Joe is a more of a persona than he is a real person. But we talk about Joe quite actively within our team discussions, whether we're talking about a new marketing opportunity or a new, product feature. And Joe is, a guy who suffered from a brain injury, had a motorbike accident. He's a fictional character, but having that kind of anchor that we talk about, every day amongst the team, if you asked anyone who's Joe, they'd be able to tell you Joe's story. So having that kind of reminder of why we're doing it, because, ultimately we want to impact people's lives.
Part of the reason why your story and your mission resonate with me so much is, when I was a kid, it wasn't a motorbike, but it was, a push bike, a jump bike. I had a similar thing, ended up in Great Ormond Street. I was in a coma for a week or so. So on a personal level, I know what my experience was like, and thinking that obviously there wasn't really any sort of consultation or rehab or support after that. You don't know what you're going to be faced with. The clinicians don't know, your family don't know, your friends don't know. They're just dealing with the kind of the symptoms as they present themselves. So, I was 12 at the time, but, equally, whether you're an adult, whether you're a kid, they're all unique sort of challenges. So, on a personal level, that's why that kind of really resonated with me. And I think it's interesting having this persona you've created, Joe, of, it's almost detaching, but not desensitizing the emotions. Cause I think sometimes when emotions can cloud judgment, so having this external kind of persona of this is Joe's story, this is who we're serving, it can take the emotion and everything out of the equation then, right?
Absolutely, and we're several, sort of layers removed from, being in a hospital, treating a patient, but every time we go into a hospital, it's really humbling, to hear people's stories, and it quite it's quite difficult at times, because these are really difficult situations that people find themselves in. But you realize that, something like a brain injury, it's totally non-discriminatory. It can happen to anyone at any time. You could walk into the street and trip over. You could, get injured, in a rugby match. You could fall down the stairs, trip over something that you left on the stairs the night before. It can happen to anyone at any time. And unfortunately, we now know quite a lot of people that it has impacted. But bringing that back into the team, as you said, in a constructive way, that we can almost harness that, not let it kind of blur your judgment or not let it kind of, lead to emotional decisions, but actually harness the power of, well, why are we doing this? At the end of the day, we're just building a bit of technology. We're writing lines of code, we're designing features. It could be doing anything, but actually bringing that back home to go, every time someone does an assessment on Melo, that's potentially helping someone rehab quicker or get out of hospital quicker or have a better future. That's really powerful.
And so let's have a little bit of a zoom in, though, looking specifically at Mellow, how you've gone from personal anecdotes and connecting with people's stories to actually creating something that's resulting in tangible outcomes.
Absolutely. At the heart of it, Melo is a clinical decision support tool. What that means is that it's not an app that, a patient downloads and uses themselves. It's there to support the clinical teams that are looking after the patient. If we were talking kind of B2B or B2C, it's a B2B model. We build the technology, provide licenses to hospitals across the UK. They use our technology to enable their clinical teams to do a better job. At its basic point, that's, kind of how it works. Those clinical teams, though, might be made up of psychologists, physios, occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, ward staff, nurses, anyone who is in that kind of wraparound sort of multidisciplinary team that looks after the patient as they're going through their rehab. And previously, what they used to do was look at behavior in a very kind of unstructured, non-systematic way. So, word of mouth, shift handovers, talking about the patient who's on in bed 5, who, is maybe struggling whenever, their family leaves and they get really upset. And how do they deal with that? And what interventions they need to put in place to try and stop that happening next time. They may have some paper-based forms that they fill in. So there's some structured assessment tools out there that academia have kind of created over the years, but no one had really brought them into the 21st century and digitized them. And then ultimately, if you have all of this information, what do you do with it? It's like anything, isn't it? If you're not getting insights and trends, it's just data, it's just noise. So how do we cut through that noise for busy clinicians so that ultimately they can make better, smarter, quicker decisions? Essentially, someone would log in, they would use Melo to conduct a structured assessment of the patient. And we've got multiple different types of assessments now in Melo. So it's not a one size fits all. The neuro rehab hospital in London might have a slightly different approach to the kind of rehabilitation clinic, in the Northwest, because they're treating different patient groups. So we can kind of tailor it and localize it for different settings. And then more recently, like everyone, we've been looking at how we can bring AI into the play as well. So we've got a couple of things in kind of R&D at the moment. One of them is out there being tested with clinicians, which we're really excited about, which is using a sort of a standard LLM model, but really focusing on the prompt engineering side of things so that we can take all of this data and put it through a structured process to be able to provide clinical grade summaries of that data at the end of it using AI. So previously, you might have been able to serve a lot of that data back to a clinician, and they would have been still having to interpret a dashboard or read a report or even look back over 2 years worth of data for an individual patient. Now we can put that through our AI layer, and within around 5 seconds, we can produce a clinical level summary that looks at trends, insights, behavioral triggers, and the best interventions for that patient. So that's one example of kind of where we've moved from being just a digital tool into now what we call, an AI enhanced sort of SaaS platform. So in a nutshell, that's what Melo does. It helps to make behavior more visible, more measurable, and more actionable at scale.
So if I'm kind of summarizing that correctly, if people are changing shifts and one person's done the assessment but not done a effective handover, they might not be getting the most tailored treatment for their needs. Is that sort of right?
That's bang on. I think, there's so many use cases that we've discovered of how it helps, on the ground kind of improve communication across teams. You mentioned one there being shift handovers. So you might be moved to a new ward, and as a member of staff, you might be assigned to work with a particular patient. You've got no idea what that patient is, going through or what some of their challenges are. And previously, there was very little to equip you with the right information to be able to go in and provide the right level of care for that patient. You would almost have to learn as you go. And sometimes that led to, adverse incidents. If that patient was actually suffering from high levels of agitation or aggression. Sometimes patients can lash out. So there's a whole kind of staff safety element in this as well. So we're not just trying to improve outcomes for patients, we're actually trying to provide staff with better tooling so that they can be safer, that they can do their job better, and ultimately take out a lot of the time that they were wasting on laborious admin, paper-based forms, typing it up, to maybe several days later see a report. We've managed to take out, between 1 and 2 days a week for clinical teams of admin time so that that time can be redirected back to actually providing patient care and working with patients, working with families. So yeah, there's a whole range of different ways it can benefit people, but it's ultimately about, making clinical teams more optimized in what they do through the use of technology.
I read a fascinating book years ago, and one of the kind of case studies in it was talking about the medical sector specifically and the traditional hierarchies within these clinical environments. So I guess my question on that is understanding the use case, the time that can be saved, and how the outcomes can be optimized leveraging your technology. Interested in understanding how this sort of technology has been received.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted question, and I guess I could wear different hats to answer that because I actually worked in the NHS for a while in the kind of the innovation arm, looking at, how you bring technology and innovation into the NHS to solve problems. And I guess now that's what I do from the other side of the fence. I'm trying to, scale, our product into the NHS and private healthcare. But I think ultimately on both sides, you need to improve patient outcomes. First and foremost, you need to add clinical value. So, if you've got a bit of kit that you think is a great idea, but it's not actually solving a real problem for a clinician, you're not going to get very far, and so many people are like, but my product's amazing. It does X, Y, and Z, but what problem does it solve? Nobody's interested. So I think you have to start with the problem. So we spent probably the first 18 months, kind of just out there talking to people, visiting hospitals, stalking people on LinkedIn to get introductions, going to networking events, and really just trying to understand what's the problem that we're trying to solve. And then we built the technology. So I think partly, getting your technology into a huge complex organization is about understanding, well, what's the benefit, what's the problem that you're solving, not just shouting really loudly because you've got a fancy new bit of kit. So I think that's one element of it. The second is understanding that it's a very long game, sort of building a health tech product. You might have an amazing product that you've put together pretty rapidly, but that's almost the start of the journey, not the end of it, because you've got things like regulation, you've got things like clinical safety, you've got things like evidence that all take time to get in place and generate. And without having all of those building blocks in place, you don't have the foundations for kind of getting your technology into large organizations. So I think looking back, some of that we've learned as we've gone. There's been times where you're thinking we should be further on than where we are, but then actually some of it we knew going into it. So we almost went into this with our eyes open because of previous experience in other companies and also working in the NHS. So we're able to almost map out that it would probably take us at least 2 to 3 years before we are generating any kind of revenue. So that really helps you as a business be able to understand that if we're in this, we're in this for the long game, but we've also got to find ways of funding the business before we can actually really expect someone to start using our technology, you know. And I think sometimes founders in health tech, they go into it thinking that, oh, within a year we'll be up and running and everyone will be buying our product. And once one hospital has used it, everyone will adopt it. I guess you quite often find out the hard way that it's a very, very complex sector to work in because unlike other sectors, you've got some of those layers around things like clinical evidence, clinical safety, data security, procurement in the NHS, for example. These are all quite complex layers that stand between you as an innovator and actually getting your product to market.
Like, I think the greatest kind of takeaway or lesson from me learned from me there is start with the problem in mind. I guess kind of following on from that, if you start with the problem in mind, you're creating alignment between the product team and the sales team from the off. You're not got a product team over engineering a solution that they want to build and a sales team flogging a product they think people need. You're creating that alignment from the get go. Correct me if I'm wrong, first of all, but would love to then kind of move on to like how you actually started winning those first few customers.
Yeah, it's so looking back, I could sit here and tell you that it was all part of a big master plan, and we had a big spreadsheet, and everything went to plan, and I'd probably be lying to you. So, some of it is luck, some of it is being in the right place at the right time, some of it is meeting the right people, and then them sort of championing what you do. So looking back, it's easier to see how it kind of fell in place. But at the time, we were doing what a lot of startups do. You're hustling, you're trying to get introductions, you're trying to get someone to take a bit of a leap of faith with you. And we struck lucky because we met a particular clinician who now actually works with us as well. He's on our books part time. So Dr. Stephen Mullen, who was a neuropsychologist in the NHS, and he saw what we were trying to do. He got it pretty quickly, and because he also had this problem, he saw this problem day in, day out. But the organization where he was working at the time probably wasn't ready to embrace, a new way of doing things. But he had a fantastic network, and he introduced us to some other clinicians that he'd worked with in other hospitals. That then led us to meeting another clinician, Dr. Alistair Teager, over at Salford Royal in Manchester. And we were lucky enough that at the time there was an innovation competition running. So it really was kind of introductions, right place, right time. And we won this Dragon's Den style competition. I think we got £30,000, which sounds a lot of money, but really, when you look at how much we've spent over the 4 years to build what we've got, it's a drop in the ocean, but that got us going. And then we were able to do some work with them. That then allowed us to start looking at other things like grant funding. We got an angel investor on board relatively early days. So we built up a little bit of momentum, just in that first kind of phase with one single hospital. And we didn't even have a product at that point. We were prototyping and testing and getting feedback and ripping it apart and starting all over again. And then that allowed us to get to a point where we were ready to actually, go live. But go live meant, a very small contained trial on one ward in one hospital. And that's really how we got started. So that was probably about 2.5 years ago now. I remember the day where the assistant psychologist on the ward logged into Melo for the very first time and entered their user details and added the first patient. And we were going, wow, we've got one user. And so still remember that day fondly. But yeah, I think to answer your question about how did we get going, that was the way that we did it. We found a clinical sponsor within the organization who believed in what we were trying to achieve. We managed to find some modest pots of kind of grant funding money that was available at the time, because we knew that we were so far away from being able to actually make any sales or generate sort of license revenue. And that just allowed us to get going. And then we built from there. We had a really successful kind of 12-month pilot with Salford Royal in the end. We assessed over 100 patients. We wrote that up into a clinical case study, and then started knocking on doors of other hospitals saying, would you like to talk to us about what we've done with Salford? So it really was that kind of getting out there, meeting people. I don't think we've ever done one cold email, in 4 years. It's not that type of model. It's about building relationships and trust, and, not letting people down. If we're working with patient data and, we don't do what we say that we're going to do, that trust that you takes a long time to earn can disappear very quickly as well. So we put a lot of emphasis on, looking after data as securely as we can. We spend a fair amount of money on that each year. And that's a key component of keeping that trust with clinicians, because I think a lot of clinicians are maybe a little bit jaded or burnt out by people coming along and promising them some shiny new bit of kit that's going to solve every problem, and then it crashes all the time, or they log in and the data's gone missing, or even worse, they log in and they see someone else's data. So yeah, I think an element of the way that we've built is really leveraging that first starting point, and we'll forever be grateful for those introductions and the initial grant funding, but then really trying to build trust within the sector.
So it sounds like establishing those champions early on were really quite catalytic for you in getting connected with other people. You mentioned Salford Royal, but also some of the other kind of clinicians that you got early on and got kind of on board, or champions for you internally. The inflection point sounded like that's when you had that successful pilot with Salford Royal, when you can go out and you can be more aligned with other kind of SaaS businesses of, hey, do you want to see what we've done for this company? As soon as you've got that case study, I think it makes a monumental difference in then, for want of a better phrase, outbound prospecting, because it's immediately gives you some sort of leverage, or gives you right to kind of be in the room, or be right to kind of reaching out, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't perfect. I don't think anything is ever perfect first time. We learned a lot from that first pilot that, we've done differently within the product. We learned a lot in terms of the practical application of, even just getting technology into a hospital. The some of the challenges around things like Wi-Fi connection, and sort of old hospitals with black spots where they can't log on to your system. So it really helped us learn a lot of the kind of the foundational things that we've then taken into deployment number 2, deployment number 3, and into other hospitals. I think the other really sort of important sort of part of that pilot was that we went in the hospital day in, day out. We went in and we visited and we did staff workshops and things like that. But we had fantastic kind of research assistant who was 2.5 days on the ward in the hospital and 2.5 days working with us, working for us at Decently. And she was kind of like our eyes and ears on the ground. So if you look at any innovation doing a pilot with a company or an organization, a lot of people are only reliant on sort of secondhand feedback as to how that pilot is going. You can maybe do a user survey, or you can look at some analytics, or you maybe have a catch-up meeting with your project sponsor once a week, and they tell you a filtered version of how it's being used on the shop floor. Whereas we actually had someone in there, using our product, but then sitting as part of our product team as well.
You
We
had a spy.
we had a Slack channel directly with her, and she'd be going, yeah, I've just tried to train 3 new staff and this wasn't great and that wasn't great. Right, quick, let's improve it. So that sort of rapid iteration of the product over those first 12 months was really enabled by having that spy, as you described them, but some eyes and ears on the ground. And we probably wouldn't have been able to make as sort of swift progress if we hadn't have had that.
That's brilliant. I think that's so interesting. So 4 years in now, just celebrating your fourth birthday. Based on the kind of the traction and the lessons learned over this initial 4 years of the company, what's the future look like, and how's the sort of approach going to evolve and change kind of as you're growing, maybe from a product and innovation standpoint, but also from your kind of commercial go-to-market approach?
Yeah, I think we've still got a lot to achieve. We've now done 20,000 plus assessments across 5 different hospitals. We've hit a certain level of recurring annual revenue that is broadly on track with a business of our size and sort of stage. But we want to take this a lot further than where we're at the moment. We want to look at other patient conditions that we can support. While we've done a lot of work in neurobehavior, so resulting from brain injury, we're now into year 2 of a dementia pilot with Liverpool University Hospitals. So that covers 3 hospitals in the Liverpool region: Broad Green, Aintree, and the Royal. That's going really well. So again, like we got to with Salford, where we had that case study about how it can impact in neuro, we see that, creating that case study around dementia then allows us to go out into a much wider sort of patient space. Dementia, unfortunately, is probably going to impact one in two of us in our lifetime. So, the numbers are much bigger. But again, neuro rehabilitation after brain injury, dementia are kind of two areas, but there are other areas as well. We're conscious that we don't want to try and be everything to everyone, but the complexity of neurological conditions, mental health, learning disability, autism, PTSD. There's a whole range of people out there that we could help. And if we can prove that our technology works equally as well in these different domains, we can obviously extend the impact and the reach that we can have. So that's one element. The second element is doing more with the product itself. I mentioned generative AI. I believe that we're probably already behind the curve with that a little bit, in that in the next 6 to 12 months, every bit of SaaS software that you use will have a generative AI button in it somewhere. Most of them already do, don't they? So 12 months ago, that wasn't the case. We were just seeing things like it appear in, Gemini, and ChatGPT was becoming more used and, more kind of accepted. Whereas now, pretty much every bit of SaaS kit that you have that you put information into, whether that's voice or text or images, you can click a button and it will summarize it for you. You can do it in Slack now, you can do it in Gmail. So I think that will almost become almost like a hygiene factor type feature that will just be expected in Melo. And we're on our way to being there with that. But the exciting thing for us is the data. And I guess this goes back all the way back to my days of working in big data with weather data. I can nerd out on kind of, big data sets and stuff like that. But, we're not there on our own. 20,000 assessments is great, but it's probably not enough to build, a predictive algorithm. But that's where we want to go. So at the moment, we're fostering some collaborations with some large organizations in the UK who have more data than we do, but we have the sort of expertise and the technology to maybe do more with that data. So longer term, what we want to explore is moving from kind of how can we predict deterioration before it happens from a behavioral point of view, so that actually we can intercept and we can change the trajectory of someone's care. Now that sounds, almost quite kind of futuristic, but there are studies out there that show that you can do this. You can use things like machine learning to look at, observational data over the course of someone's rehab and actually predict, that there might be an escalation in that person's aggression levels or agitation levels, or they might just, need a different approach on a certain day, because the data shows us that for the last 6 weeks, it's always a Tuesday afternoon that they, become agitated because of, I don't know, some kind of environmental factor in the hospital. That's when the cleaners come in and noise is their particular trigger. So if we knit together all of these data points, we believe that we can create something really powerful that can actually help clinicians start to predict, when some of these behavioral needs are going to escalate. And that's super exciting, because there's a couple of companies doing something similar in the US, but no one that we've come across in the UK doing that at the moment.
So it sounds like the next kind of phase of evolution of the business is both kind of horizontal, like offering services and broadening to like wider patient groups. You mentioned autism and some other kind of neurodivergence conditions, for example, but also really in kind of shifting the focus from a reactive to more of a proactive. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think this aligns really nicely with the way that, the government in the UK is trying to take, healthcare. And I know we promised we wouldn't go too far into politics, but, the NHS kind of 10-year plan has recently been published, and it's a big long tome that, not a lot of people will probably read all of it, but there's a nice exec summary, or ask ChatGPT to summarize it for you. And two of the key themes in there, one is around moving services from analog to digital. So, Melo can help with that. Let's get rid of paper. Let's get rid of Excel spreadsheets. Let's get everyone, doing things in a smarter way. But the other one, which is the bigger one, is moving from reactive healthcare to preventative healthcare. So how can we actually get ahead of the curve, through things like AI, through things like, sort of wearables, through things, that maybe haven't been tried before, and actually shift the dial from having to spend a lot of money and a lot of resources treating people to actually spending more money keeping people healthy in the first place. And, if we can play a part in that kind of paradigm shift, that's going to be really exciting. And that's not going to happen overnight. That could happen over, the next 10 years or so. But I think we're really well placed with where we're at, both as a business and our technology to play a key role in that. Um, Obviously, though, longer term, we are still an early stage startup, and there's no guarantees. We managed to secure some investment 2 years ago. We did a pre-seed round, and that was fantastic because it allowed us to grow the team. It allowed us to accelerate product development. It allowed us to get some of the regulatory work that I mentioned behind us and checked off. But we know that we need to grow, and we are growing through revenue at the moment. We are generating revenue, which is fantastic, but probably not, at a quick enough rate right now to match the ambitions of which we've got. So I think you asked about from a business point of view, we want to raise some more money. We're talking to investors at the moment. We're looking beyond the UK. So, the UK market is fantastic. It's obviously our home market, but if we can build something digital, then it should be borderless. Obviously, there's different regulations if you go to the US or you go to the Nordics, but ultimately the clinical problem is still the same. So yeah, we've got big ambitions for where we want to be over the next few years. And I guess time will tell, if we have the luck and the sort of the fair wind in our sails to get there, because not everyone does, do they? And we can't take it for granted. So yeah, a lot of hard work ahead of us, but still, some big milestones that we want to reach.
Mm. So I think you've already got to a phenomenal position 4 years on that you're still going strong. You're generating revenue. You've got probably further 90% or more of health tech startups, but cash is still king and it's the lifeblood of the business. You've already developed and created something that is demonstrating value. You've had successful pilots, which is demonstrating proof that your platform, that Melo works. You've got grand plans for how you're going to expand this. I think we could do an entirely separate podcast looking and exploring wearables and how we can improve health outcomes in a more proactive sort of way. We won't go into that now, but kind of closing off, investment is, I guess, the main determinant of being able to kind of fulfill those future plans.
I'd probably swap out the word investment for capital. I think if we could grow our business just through accelerating revenue, that I guess that's every founder's dream, isn't it? The investment merry-go-round is just as tough as trying to sell into large complex organizations. We've had more no's than we've had yeses. It's a big amount of time that it takes away as founders from actually working on your product, but sometimes that's the best route to get from A to B quicker. So, we have taken investment. We will be open to investment in the future, but there are other ways of bringing capital into your business. And if we can do that through, finding other revenue streams, we've got some really interesting trials at the moment in more of a B2B to C space, or some smaller private organizations that weren't necessarily on our revenue roadmap 12 months ago, and we wouldn't be where we are today without, the support of people like Innovate UK, NIHR, which is the National Institute of Health Research, STFC, which is the Science and Technologies Facilities Council. All of these organizations exist in the UK to help boost and fund innovation for early stage startups. So I think, yeah, your question about does a business need capital to grow? Absolutely. But I think if we could have our way, it would almost be revenue led, you know, investment, if it's the right investment, but also, yeah, I guess a word of advice, then, take advantage of the grant funding and R&D tax credits and other systematic sort of mechanisms that exist in the UK to help people like ourselves, because they just don't exist for every founder in every country.
And you dropped a golden nugget there already and several throughout the podcast. But I guess wrapping up, what I wanted to kind of invite you to do to leave the listeners and myself with is, what's the greatest lesson you've learned, whether relevant to the health tech space or just generally in life and entrepreneurialism?
I think coming back to what we were talking about in terms of the problem. You know, if you're not in love with the problem that you're trying to solve and you're just interested in building a shiny product, it's probably not sustainable, because you'll either get to a point where you think you're done and you're like, oh, I can move on to something else now, or a new thing appears and you want to go off and explore that, or you just won't necessarily have the resilience to get through the harder points of the journey. Everyone talks about, the ups in the sort of journey, but there's plenty of downs as well. We had to let some people go earlier on this year. We hit a point where cash flow wasn't, sort of materializing as quickly as we wanted it to. And, you have to make hard decisions. And if you think that it's all going to be plain sailing and it's all going to look great on LinkedIn and it's all going to be about going to awards ceremonies and networking events, then you don't necessarily understand what it takes to actually build a business, build a product from zero. And I think going back to if you're not in love with the problem, you'll probably just run out of energy. You'll run out of resilience. You'll run out of that passion, I guess, that drives you to keep going.
I think that's such a great place to kind of wrap up. I've learned so much, but I think the greatest lesson, I'm glad you kind of finished with it, is, you know, start with the problem and love the problem. Because it's not just creating that alignment between product teams and sales teams, but it's having that resiliency, having that ability to kind of keep going when the going gets tough, and avoid the distractions of the shiny objects. James, look, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, and I'm so grateful for you sharing your story and the story of the business. And wishing you every success. I'll be following the kind of the business and keen to maybe book in another kind of catch up. We can do another one of these in sort of 6 to 12 months time and see what's changed.
That would be amazing. Yeah, really, really enjoyed it, David. I can't believe where the time's gone.